close your eyes and let the mists of ancient time gather around you. Tonight we venture not to Mount Olympus where Zeus holds court, nor to the famous temples of Athena and Apollo. Instead, we slip into the shadowed corners of Greek mythology, to the sacred groves and hidden springs where dwell the forgotten gods, those divine beings whose names have faded from memory, whose temples have crumbled to dust, whose stories are whispered only in the oldest texts. Let these ancient tales carry you gently into sleep, as we honor the gods whom time has overlooked, the gods of beginnings and endings. Long before Zeus claimed the thunderbolt, before even the Titans walked the earth, there existed the protogenoi, the primordial deities who were not born but simply came into being from the cosmic void. Among these first powers was Aether, the god of pure upper air and light, the very substance the gods breathed, bright and luminous, different from the heavy air mortals knew. Aether was the son of Erebus, the darkness, and Nyx, the night, born of shadow, but himself radiant, the first light to pierce the primordial darkness. He was the light of heaven, the glow that suffused the realm of the gods, not harsh like his sister Hemera, who was day, but gentle and all-pervading. The ancient Greeks believed that Aether was what filled the space above the clouds, the celestial realm where gods dwelled in eternal brightness. When mortals died and their souls rose, they passed through Aether, and some said this passage through divine light was what purified the soul. Aether had no temples, no priests, no sacrifices, for how could one worship the very air of heaven? Yet he was essential, present in every breath the gods took, in every shaft of light that broke through storm clouds. The philosophers spoke of him more than the poets. They understood that Aether represented something fundamental, the divine substance that separated the realm of gods from the realm of mortals. Alongside Aether dwelt his sister, Hemera, goddess of the day itself, not the sun, which was Helios, but the daylight that filled the world from dawn to dusk. Each morning, Hemera emerged from Tartarus, where she dwelt with her mother Nyx during the night hours, and she scattered the mists of darkness, allowing mortals to see and work. Each evening, as Hemera descended back to Tartarus, her mother Nyx would emerge, and they would pass each other at the threshold, one coming as the other departed, eternal and unchanging. This was the rhythm of existence, mother night and daughter day, forever trading places, never occupying the world at the same time. Hemera was the brightness that allowed life to flourish, hours of light when humans could labor and conduct their affairs. Without her, there would be only endless night, only Nyx's starlit darkness. Yet mortals rarely thought to honor Hemera specifically, for they took daylight for granted, never considering that it was itself a goddess, that the brightness they worked by was a divine presence. Only the very oldest prayers, the ones whispered by the first Greeks, remembered to greet Hemera by name when the dawn came. And when life ended, when the bright hours of Hemera gave way permanently to eternal night, souls encountered the Keres, the female death spirits, daughters of Nyx, sisters of doom and fate. The Keres were not gentle, like Thanatos, the personified death who brought peaceful endings. No, the Keres were violent death incarnate, the spirits of battlefield slaughter, disease, and cruel fate. They were depicted as dark, winged women with talons and teeth, dressed in blood-red cloaks, haunting battlefields and waiting for men to fall. When a warrior received his death wound, it was a Care who descended upon him, her talons sinking into his soul to drag it down to Hades. The Keres were plural because death came in many forms: death by sword, by spear, by arrow, by disease, by accident, by age. Each had its own spirit. Homer wrote that each man had his own care assigned to him at birth, following him invisibly throughout life, waiting for the moment decreed by fate when she would claim him. The Keres could be deterred by courage, and fate could sometimes be delayed, but never forever escaped. After great battles, the Keres were said to feast on the blood of the fallen, drinking their fill before the souls descended to the underworld. Mortals feared the Keres above almost all other spirits, for they represented not just death, but violent, painful death, death that came too soon and took men in their prime. Warriors made offerings to turn away the Keres, to ask that if death came, it would be swift and not prolonged, that the care assigned to them would be merciful. But the Keres showed no mercy. They were ancient forces, older than mercy, older than compassion, embodiments of death's cruelty. Yet even the Keres bowed to Thanatos, the gentle god of peaceful death, brother of Hypnos, who was sleep. Thanatos was somber and impartial, neither cruel nor kind, simply inevitable. When someone's thread was cut by the Moirai, the fates, Thanatos would come, appearing as a beautiful young man with black wings, sometimes bearing a sword to cut the soul from the body, sometimes simply touching the dying person gently. Unlike the Keres, who were feared and dreaded, Thanatos was accepted, even respected, for he brought the release from suffering, the end of pain and toil. The Greeks did not worship Thanatos. One does not worship death, but they acknowledged him in their prayers, asking for his mercy, that when he came, he would come gently. There was only one recorded instance of Thanatos being cheated, when Sisyphus, that most cunning of mortals, tricked Thanatos and chained him. And for a time, no mortals died. The gods were horrified. Death was necessary, part of the cosmic order, and they sent Ares to free Thanatos and ensure Sisyphus received appropriate punishment. The tale served as a lesson. Death cannot be escaped, should not be escaped, for it is part of the natural order. Thanatos represented this truth, neither enemy nor friend, but simply the end that comes to all mortal things, as inevitable as sunrise, as necessary as breath. Strom, the gods of fortune and fate. Before the great Moirai, the three fates who spun, measured, and cut the threads of life, there existed older powers who governed fortune and chance. Among these was Tyche, goddess of fortune, luck, and prosperity. Tyche was one of the Oceanids, daughter of the Titan Oceanus and Tethys, and she governed what mortals called luck, that seemingly random force that made some prosper and others fail. The Greeks understood that skill and virtue mattered, but they also knew that chance played its role. The merchant ship caught by storms, the farmer whose crops failed despite his labor, the soldier who survived battle when better warriors fell. This was Tyche's domain. She was often depicted wearing a mural crown, representing the cities whose fortune she governed, and holding a cornucopia symbolizing the prosperity she could bestow, along with a rudder representing how she could steer fortunes in any direction. Each city had its own Tyche, who watched over its collective fortune, and individuals too had their personal Tyche, determining their luck. Offerings to Tyche were common before any uncertain venture, before a journey, before a business deal, before planting crops. But Tyche was fickle and unpredictable by nature. She might smile on a beggar and make him rich, then turn away from a king and reduce him to poverty. The Greeks knew that fortune was a wheel, constantly turning, lifting some up while casting others down. No one could command Tyche or earn her favor through virtue alone. She granted and withdrew her blessings according to patterns mortals could not discern. This randomness was her essential nature, and it taught mortals humility. The wisest Greeks understood that when fortune smiled on them, it was temporary, a gift to be grateful for, but not to be trusted as permanent. And when fortune frowned, that too would pass in time, for Tyche's wheel was always turning. Closely connected to Tyche was Nemesis, whose name meant retribution or just indignation, but who was far more complex than a simple goddess of revenge. Nemesis was the force that maintained balance, that brought down those who rose too high and elevated those cast too low. She was particularly concerned with hubris, that excessive pride and arrogance that led mortals to forget they were mortal, to act as if they were gods. When someone's good fortune led them to arrogance, to cruelty, to forgetting reverence for the gods, Nemesis would mark them. She did not act immediately, for the Greeks believed divine justice took time, but eventually she would bring them low, often through the very thing they took pride in. A king proud of his power might lose his kingdom. A beauty proud of her looks might be scarred. A warrior confident in his strength might be defeated by someone weaker. This was Nemesis, not vindictive, but corrective, restoring the balance that hubris had disrupted. She was often depicted with wings, carrying a sword or a whip, sometimes holding a wheel like Tyche's, to show how she turned fortune around. Some said she was the mother of Helen of Troy, having been pursued by Zeus, who took the form of a swan. Even in her own story, she could not escape the god's will. Nemesis had a temple at Rhamnus, in Attica, where she was honored with sacrifices, particularly by those who wished to avoid her attention, or by those who felt others had escaped justice and invoked her intervention. The wise Greeks knew to honor Nemesis by practicing moderation, by remembering their mortal limits, by showing humility even in success. Her Nemesis saw everything, and though she might be slow, she never forgot. And her justice, when it came, was absolute. The ancient Dactyls, whose name meant fingers, were mysterious divine beings, perhaps gods, perhaps magical humans. associated with Mount Ida in both Crete and Phrygia. The stories about them were old and confused, with different regions telling different tales. Some said there were 5 Dactyls, male spirits who served the great mother goddess Rhea or Cybele, working as smiths and sorcerers in the mountains. Others said there were 10 Dactyls, 5 male and 5 female, representing the fingers of both hands. The male Dactyls were smiths who discovered ironworking and the art of working metal, teaching these crucial skills to humanity. They were also powerful magicians who knew songs of power and spells that could bind or loose, heal or harm. The Dactyls were present at Zeus's birth, according to some tales, protecting the infant god from his father Kronos with their magic and the loud clanging of their smithing, which drowned out the baby's cries. In some versions, the Dactyls founded the ancient Olympic Games, establishing the sacred competitions long before the historical games began. The Phrygian Dactyls were associated with the mystery cults, knowing secret rites and sacred knowledge passed down from the time of the Titans. These mysterious beings existed at the intersection of divine and mortal, perhaps ancient shamans or priests who had been elevated to divine status, or perhaps truly immortal beings who had taught early humans essential crafts. Over time, the Dactyls merged with or were confused with other groups of minor deities, the Telchines, the Keres, the Corybantes, all mysterious, ancient powers associated with magic, metalworking, and secret knowledge. What remained clear was that the Dactyls were old, older than many of the Olympian gods, preserving knowledge from an earlier age when the lines between divine and mortal, between magic and craft, were less distinct. The gods of nature's hidden places, in the deep forests where sunlight barely penetrated, where ancient trees grew thick and streams ran clear and cold, dwelt the Meliae, the nymphs of the ash trees. The Meliae were born from the blood of Erinyes when his son Kronos castrated him, those drops of divine blood that fell upon the earth. From them sprang the Meliae, making them incredibly ancient, older than Zeus, older than most gods mortals knew. The ash tree was sacred in Greek thought, for from ash wood came the shafts of spears, the weapons of warriors. The Meliae were nurse spirits who cared for the infant Zeus in some tales, protecting him in the mountain caves of Crete, along with the Dactyls and the Keres. They were the spirits of the mountain ash trees, particularly numerous in Arcadia and other wild, mountainous regions. The Meliae knew the secret properties of plants, how to heal with herbs, and they taught these arts to the few mortals they favored. Unlike the Dryads, who were tied to their specific trees and would die if their tree died, the Meliae were a collective spirit of all ash trees, ancient and powerful. They were also connected to honey, for in the Golden Age before the discovery of agriculture, the Meliae provided humanity with ash honey, perhaps a reference to the sweet sap or to honeycomb found in hollow ash trees. The worship of the Meliae was old and local, practiced in mountain groves by shepherds and rural folk who still remembered the ancient ways. They received offerings of milk and honey at the base of ash trees, simple gifts for these ancient spirits who cared little for elaborate temples, but appreciated remembrance. As the classical period progressed and Greek culture became more urbanized, the Meliae faded from memory, remembered only in the oldest texts and the most conservative rural cults. But in the deep mountain forests, where ancient ash trees still stood, the Meliae endured, eternal as the woods themselves. The god Priapus was a rustic deity of gardens, orchards, and fertility, particularly associated with the protection of crops and the punishment of thieves. Priapus was the son of Aphrodite and Dionysus, or in some versions, Aphrodite and Adonis, or even Aphrodite and Hermes. The stories varied, but his mother was always Aphrodite. However, when Priapus was born, Hera, ever jealous of Aphrodite's affairs, cursed the infant with permanent arousal and exaggerated genitalia, making him grotesque. Aphrodite, ashamed of her misshapen son, abandoned him, and he was raised by shepherds and farmers. Despite his unfortunate appearance, Priapus became a beloved god of the countryside, particularly among farmers and gardeners who set up wooden statues of him in their fields and orchards to protect against thieves and pests. These statues were often painted bright colors and showed Priapus's distinctive feature prominently, sometimes carrying a sickle or cornucopia. The threat was clear. Thieves who stole from a garden protected by Priapus would face uncomfortable punishment. Beyond this protective role, Priapus was also a fertility god, ensuring that crops were abundant and trees bore fruit. His worship was widespread in the Hellenistic period, particularly in port cities and trading centers, where he was also invoked for commercial success. Despite his crude image, Priapus appeared in sophisticated poetry, where poets used him as a figure of both comedy and pathos, a god who was absurd yet also pitiable, powerful in his sphere, yet rejected by the other gods. In gardens throughout the Greek world, his statue stood watch, honored with simple offerings of flowers, fruits, and the first harvest, a god of humble origins, protecting the humble labor of growing food. High in the mountains, where the air grew thin and cold, where snow gathered even in summer, and winds howled around bare peaks, dwelt Chione, goddess of snow. Chione was the daughter of Boreas, the north wind, and Erythea, making her a sibling to the Boreads and to Cleopatra. She personified snow and winter's bite, her touch turning rain to flakes, covering the world in white. The ancient Greeks, living in a Mediterranean climate, saw snow as mysterious and somewhat divine, appearing on mountain peaks and occasionally descending to the lowlands in harsh winters. Chione was sometimes depicted as a beautiful maiden dressed in white, crowned with frost, her breath visible in cold air. In one tale, Chione was a mortal woman, daughter of Daedalion, so beautiful that she caught the attention of both Apollo and Hermes in the same day. Each god lay with her, and she bore twin sons, Philemon, son of Apollo, who became a great musician, and Autolycus, son of Hermes, who inherited his father's thieving skills. But Chione became prideful, boasting that she was more beautiful even than Artemis, and for this hubris, Artemis shot her through the tongue with an arrow. Her father Daedalian, mad with grief, threw himself from a cliff, but Apollo took pity and transformed him into a hawk. The confusion between Chione, the goddess of snow, and Chione the mortal exemplifies how Greek mythology often had multiple figures with the same name, stories that intertwined and contradicted, layers of tradition building over centuries. What remained clear was that Chione represented snow, that strange, cold, beautiful manifestation of water that fell from the sky and transformed the world into something silent and still, covering the familiar in unfamiliar white. Mountain shepherds who brought their flocks to high pastures in summer knew to watch for Chione's arrival in autumn, for her presence meant it was time to descend before the passes closed. They offered prayers to her for mild winters and early springs, that her reign would be brief and not extend too long into the growing season. The gods of craft and labor. Hephaestus was well known as the smith god, but few remembered his helpers, the divine craftsmen who worked alongside him in his volcanic forges. Among these were the Cabiri, mysterious deities associated with metalworking, fire, and secret rites. The Cabiri were worshipped particularly on the island of Samothrace, where their mystery cult rivaled that of Eleusis in importance, though it was far more secretive. The exact nature of the Cabiri was uncertain. Different sources gave different accounts of their number, parentage, and nature. Some said they were 2 gods, some said 3 or 4, others said 7. They might have been sons of Hephaestus and Cabiro, a sea nymph, or they might have been more ancient still, pre-Greek gods whose worship the Greeks adopted and adapted. What was clear was that the Cabiri were powerful protectors, particularly of sailors and those who traveled by sea. Initiates into the Cabiri mysteries wore purple bands around their waists and iron rings as symbols of their initiation. And these initiates were promised protection from shipwreck and drowning. The rites of the Cabiri were performed at night and were secret. Revealing them was forbidden, and ancient sources are frustratingly vague about what actually occurred in the ceremonies. We know there was dancing and torchlit processions, invocations and rituals, but the core mysteries were never written down, or were written in texts now lost. The Cabiri were also associated with metalworking and with fire, appropriate for beings connected to Hephaestus. Some scholars believe the Cabiri cult preserved very ancient traditions, perhaps from pre-Greek inhabitants of the Aegean, and that their secretive nature reflected their foreign origin. Philip II of Macedon met his wife Olympias at the Cabiri mysteries, and Alexander the Great was initiated into the rites, showing their continued importance into the Hellenistic period. But the secrets died with the last initiates, and now we can only guess at what mysteries the Cabiri revealed to those who joined their nocturnal ceremonies. The goddess Peitho personified persuasion and seduction, the power of words to change minds and hearts. She was often considered an attendant of Aphrodite, for seduction required persuasion, and romantic love often began with persuasive words. But Peitho was more than just a companion of Aphrodite. She was an independent goddess with her own cult, particularly important in Athens, where she had altars and received sacrifices. In Athenian thought, Peitho represented political persuasion, the art of rhetoric that was so crucial to democratic government. The ability to persuade others through arguments was fundamental to Athenian democracy, where decisions were made by convincing fellow citizens through speeches in the assembly. Thus Peitho was honored as the goddess who made democracy function, who allowed differences to be resolved through words rather than violence. Peitho was depicted as a beautiful woman, often crowning Aphrodite or standing beside her, sometimes holding a flower or a dove. In one myth, Zeus could not accomplish his plan to marry off Thetis to a mortal because a prophecy said Thetis' son would be greater than his father, until Peitho convinced Thetis to accept the mortal Peleus as her husband. Peitho also played a role in the story of Pandora. It was Peitho who gifted Pandora with seductive speech, making her lies convincing, contributing to Pandora becoming a danger to humanity. The dual nature of persuasion was clear to the Greeks. It could be used for good or ill, to achieve just outcomes, or to deceive and manipulate. Peitho represented both possibilities, the power of language, without judgment about how that power was used. Courtesans and hetairæ, the educated female companions of wealthy men, honored Peitho particularly, for their livelihood depended on their ability to charm and persuade through conversation. Peitho received offerings of flowers, perfume, and honey, sweet things for the goddess who made words sweet and convincing. In a culture that valued eloquence and placed tremendous importance on oratory skill, Peitho was essential, the divine embodiment of persuasion's power. Tyche, too, the gods of craft and labor. Hephaestus was well known as the smith god, but few remembered his helpers, the divine craftsmen who worked alongside him in his volcanic forges. Among these were the Cabiri, mysterious deities associated with metalworking, fire, and secret rites. The Cabiri were worshipped particularly on the island of Samothrace, where their mystery cult rivaled that of Eleusis in importance, though it was far more secretive. The exact nature of the Cabiri was uncertain. Different sources gave different accounts of their number, parentage, and nature. Some said they were 2 gods. Some said 3 or 4. Others said 7. They might have been sons of Hephaestus and Cabero, a sea nymph, or they might have been more ancient still, pre-Greek gods whose worship the Greeks adopted and adapted. What was clear was that the Cabiri were powerful protectors, particularly of sailors and those who traveled by sea. Initiates into the Cabiri mysteries wore purple bands around their waists and iron rings as symbols of their initiation, and these initiates were promised protection from shipwreck and drowning. The rites of the Cabiri were performed at night and were secret. Revealing them was forbidden, and ancient sources are frustratingly vague about what actually occurred in the ceremonies. We know there was dancing and torchlit processions, invocations and rituals. But the core mysteries were never written down, or were written in texts now lost. The Cabiri were also associated with metalworking and with fire, appropriate for beings connected to Hephaestus. Some scholars believe the Cabiri cult preserved very ancient traditions, perhaps from pre-Greek inhabitants of the Aegean, and that their secretive nature reflected their foreign origin. Philip II of Macedon met his wife Olympias at the Cabiri mysteries, and Alexander the Great was initiated into the rites, showing their continued importance into the Hellenistic period. But the secrets died with the last initiates, and now we can only guess at what mysteries the Cabiri revealed to those who joined their nocturnal ceremonies. The goddess Peitho personified persuasion and seduction, the power of words to change minds and hearts. She was often considered an attendant of Aphrodite, for seduction required persuasion, and romantic love often began with persuasive words. But Peitho was more than just a companion of Aphrodite. She was an independent goddess with her own cult, particularly important in Athens, where she had altars and received sacrifices. In Athenian thought, Peitho represented political persuasion, the art of rhetoric that was so crucial to democratic government. The ability to persuade others through arguments was fundamental to Athenian democracy, where decisions were made by convincing fellow citizens through speeches in the assembly. Thus, Peitho was honored as the goddess who made democracy function, who allowed differences to be resolved through words rather than violence. Peitho was depicted as a beautiful woman, often crowning Aphrodite or standing beside her, sometimes holding a flower or a dove. In one myth, Zeus could not accomplish his plan to marry off Thetis to a mortal, because a prophecy said Thetis's son would be greater than his father, until Peitho convinced Thetis to accept the mortal Peleus as her husband. Peitho also played a role in the story of Pandora. It was Peitho who gifted Pandora with seductive speech, making her lies convincing, contributing to Pandora becoming a danger to humanity. The dual nature of persuasion was clear to the Greeks. It could be used for good or ill, to achieve just outcomes or to deceive and manipulate. Peitho represented both possibilities, the power of language without judgment about how that power was used. Courtesans and heterae, the educated female companions of wealthy men, honored Peitho particularly, for their livelihood depended on their ability to charm and persuade through conversation. Peitho received offerings of flowers, perfume, and honey, sweet things for the goddess who made words sweet and convincing. In a culture that valued eloquence and placed tremendous importance on oratory skill, Peitho was essential, the divine embodiment of persuasion's power. She, the gods of emotion and desire. Pothos was one of the erotes, specifically personifying longing and yearning, that ache of desire for something or someone absent or unattainable. While his brothers Eris, desire, and Hemeros, immediate physical passion, were better known, Pothos represented something different, the sustained yearning over time, the way desire could persist and even grow when its object was distant. Pothos was depicted as a young winged man, like his brothers, often shown flying or straining forward as if pursuing something forever just out of reach. He attended Aphrodite along with his brothers, and together they represented the various aspects of desire and love. Pothos was particularly associated with the longing for one's homeland, for loved ones separated by distance or death, for lost youth, for things that once were but would never be again. This made Pothos a bittersweet god, for his domain was tinged with sadness. He represented want, the knowledge of lack, the pain of absence. Soldiers far from home felt Pothos's influence, the yearning for their families, their cities, their normal lives. Lovers separated by circumstance experienced Pothos when they thought of each other across the distance. Those who mourned the dead felt Pothos, the longing to see again those who were gone forever. Yet Pothos was not entirely painful, for yearning also implied memory and sustained connection. To long for something meant it still mattered, still held importance. In this way, Pothos was the god of fidelity through absence, of connections maintained despite separation. There were no major temples to Pothos, but his name appeared in prayers and poetry, invoked by those experiencing the particular pain-pleasure of sustained longing. The poets particularly understood Pothos, for poetry often deals with absence and desire, with the gap between wish and reality. To honor Pothos was to acknowledge that yearning, too, was sacred, that the pain of wanting was itself a form of connection, a way of keeping what was absent somehow present through the very act of desiring it. The Oneiroi, the gods of dreams, were sons of Nyx, the night, and they dwelt in the underworld near the river of forgetfulness. Through a cave with two gates, one of horn through which true dreams emerged, and one of ivory through which false dreams escaped, the Oneiroi would rise each night to visit sleeping mortals. There were countless Oneiroi, for there were countless dreams, but a few were named individually. Morpheus was chief among them, the shaper of dreams, able to take any human form and appear in dreams as kings, warriors, lovers, or friends. His brothers Phobator, also called Isolos, shaped dreams of animals and monsters, while Phantasos created dreams of inanimate objects, of places and things rather than beings. Together, the three brothers covered all possible dream content, able to create any dream scenario imaginable. The Oneiroi were messengers and tools of the gods, particularly Zeus, who would send dreams to mortals to communicate warnings, prophecy, or commands. But the Oneiroi were also independent agents who sent dreams according to their own mysterious purposes. A dream might be prophetic, revealing what was to come, or it might be merely a fantasy of wish fulfillment or anxiety. The Greeks took dreams seriously, believing they carried meaning and required interpretation. Dream interpreters, called Oneiricritics, would analyze dreams and explain their significance, understanding that the Oneiroi spoke in symbols and metaphors that needed translation. Temples of healing gods like Asclepius practiced ritual dream incubation, where sick people would sleep in the temple hoping to receive healing dreams sent by the god via the Oneiroi. The Oneiroi were neither good nor evil, but rather neutral messengers, carrying whatever content they were commanded to deliver or that emerged from their own mysterious realm. Every night, as humans fell asleep, the Oneiroi rose from their cave and spread across the world, slipping into sleeping minds, creating the strange, symbolic, emotionally charged experiences we call dreams. Morning would banish them back to their cave, but they would return with the next night, eternal as sleep itself. Closely connected to the Oneiroi were the gods Hypnos and his brother Thanatos, whom we have already met. But Hypnos, the god of sleep, deserves his own consideration, for he was more than just Thanatos's twin. Hypnos dwelt in a dark cave in the underworld, where the river Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, flowed from the rock. No light reached this cave, no sound disturbed it, and poppies grew around its entrance, their soporific properties sacred to the god. Hypnos was gentle and benevolent, a friend to mortals, for sleep was a gift, rest from labor, escape from suffering. Each night, Hypnos would travel the world on quiet wings, touching mortals and gods alike, bringing sleep. Even Zeus could be overcome by Hypnos, though the god of sleep knew that putting Zeus to sleep without permission was dangerous. In one famous tale, Hera bribed Hypnos with the promise of one of the Graces as his wife if he would put Zeus to sleep, so she could work against the Trojans without Zeus interfering. Hypnos was reluctant, remembering an earlier time when Hera had asked him to do the same thing, and Zeus had been furious when he awoke. But the bribe was too good to refuse, and Hypnos succeeded in lulling Zeus to sleep, allowing Hera to help the Greeks. The tale showed Hypnos's power, that even the king of gods could not resist sleep indefinitely, but also his vulnerability, for gods could be angry if sleep came at an inopportune moment. Hypnos had a gentler side as well, appearing in healing temples where sleep was part of the cure. Sick people would invoke Hypnos along with Asclepius, asking for restful, healing sleep in which dreams might reveal treatments or in which the body could recover. Hypnos represented the fact that humans spend a third of their lives asleep, that this state is necessary and beneficial, not merely an absence of waking, but its own kind of presence, its own realm ruled by its own gentle god. The gods of judgment and memory. In the depths of Hades' realm, beyond the river Styx and the fields of Asphodel, where ordinary souls wandered, lay Tartarus, the deepest, darkest place, where the most wicked were punished eternally. Ruling over this place of torment were the Erinyes, also called the Furies, three terrible goddesses of vengeance. Tisiphone, Megara, and Alecto were their names, and they were born like the Meliae from the blood of Uranus when Kronos castrated him. That divine blood falling on earth gave birth to three beings of wrath and retribution. The Erinyes had snakes for hair, bat wings, and dog heads in some descriptions, though other accounts made them beautiful but terrible women with whips and torches. Their purpose was to punish certain crimes, particularly those that violated the natural order: murder of kin, oath-breaking, crimes against parents and crimes against the gods. The Erinyes were relentless and implacable, pursuing the guilty without rest or mercy, driving them mad with guilt and fear. Orestes, who killed his mother Clytemnestra to avenge his father Agamemnon, was hunted by the Erinyes, despite the fact that Apollo had ordered the killing. The Erinyes did not care about justification or circumstances. Matricide was matricide, a violation of natural law, and they would punish it. Only after a trial at Athens, where Athena cast the deciding vote in Orestes' favor, were the Erinyes persuaded to relent. In honor of this verdict, the Erinyes were given a new name, the Eumenides, the kindly ones, a euphemism meant to appease them, and they were given a sacred grove in Athens, where they received sacrifices. This transformation from Erinyes to Eumenides represented the Greek idea that justice evolved from simple vengeance to more complex consideration of circumstances and intent. Yet the Erinyes/Eumenides never entirely lost their fearsome aspect. They remained the guardians of fundamental law, the assurance that certain crimes would not go unpunished, even if human justice failed. In the underworld, they supervised the punishment of the wicked, ensuring that torments were carried out appropriately. Mortals swore oaths by the Erinyes, knowing that oath-breakers would face their wrath. These ancient goddesses, older than Zeus, represented an older, harsher form of justice, yet one the Greeks could never entirely abandon, for they understood that some moral lines must not be crossed without consequence. Before the Erinyes could punish, guilt had to be remembered, and for this, the world relied on Mnemosyne, the titaness of memory, mother of the 9 muses. Mnemosyne was one of the Titans, daughter of Uranus and Gaia, and she ruled over memory and remembrance. In a pre-literate or semi-literate culture, memory was crucial. History, poetry, laws, and traditions were preserved in memory and passed down through oral recitation. To forget was to lose these things forever, so memory was sacred, and Mnemosyne was its divine guardian. Zeus lay with Mnemosyne for 9 consecutive nights, and from these unions she gave birth to the 9 muses, each of whom presided over a form of art or knowledge. Calliope for epic poetry, Clio for history, Arato for love poetry, Euterpe for music, Melpomene for tragedy, Polyhymnia for hymns, Terpsichore for dance, Thalia for comedy, and Urania for astronomy. Through the muses, Mnemosyne's gift of memory was channeled into culture and learning. Poets invoked the muses, who were memory's daughters, to help them remember the tales they would tell. Memory was also crucial in the underworld, where the river Lethe brought forgetfulness to souls drinking from it, erasing their memories before reincarnation. But there was also the pool of Mnemosyne in the underworld, mentioned in Orphic texts, from which initiates would drink to maintain their memories even in death, preserving their identity and knowledge. This made memory literally a choice between existence and non-existence, between maintaining selfhood and dissolving into oblivion. Mnemosyne received offerings from students, scholars, and performers. Anyone whose work required memory honored her. In a world without recording devices, without easy reference materials, human memory was the library, the archive, the historical record. Mnemosyne was the goddess who made culture possible, who allowed the past to inform the present, who gave mortals the ability to learn from experience and to preserve their stories across generations. Lethe herself, the river and the goddess of forgetfulness and oblivion, represented memory's opposite. Lethe flowed through the underworld, and souls who drank from her waters forgot their previous lives, losing all memory of who they had been, what they had done, whom they had loved. This forgetting was necessary for reincarnation in some Greek beliefs. A soul could not be reborn with memories of its previous life intact, for those memories would interfere with the new life. Lethe's waters provided a clean slate, allowing the soul to begin again. In this sense, Lethe was merciful, for she erased trauma and sorrow along with joy and love, giving the soul peace and freedom from the burden of the past. Yet Lethe was also feared, for to drink from her was to lose oneself, to cease being who you were in any meaningful sense. The dead who drank from Lethe became shadows, vague presences without personality or memory, barely existing at all. Some mystery cults, particularly Orphic and Pythagorean groups, taught initiates to avoid drinking from Lethe when they died, to seek instead the pool of Mnemosyne, thus maintaining memory and consciousness through death and rebirth. This made the afterlife a choice between oblivion with peace or consciousness with continued selfhood, but also continued awareness of existence's burdens. Lethe represented the seductive pull of forgetting, the desire to escape painful memories, to be released from the past. Even the living experienced Lethe's influence when they forgot, when memories faded and became unclear. Time itself was a form of Lethe, gradually erasing details, softening edges, until eventually even the most vivid experiences became vague or disappeared entirely. In this way, Lethe was always present, always working, a slow river that eventually claimed all memory except what was actively preserved through effort and ritual, through story and song, through the gifts of Mnemosyne and her daughters the Muses. H2, the gods at world's edge. Far from the civilized lands, at the edges of the known world, dwelt gods even more obscure than those we have encountered. In the far west, beyond the pillars of Heracles, where the sun sank into ocean each night, dwelt the Hesperides, nymphs of the evening and golden light of sunset. The Hesperides were 3 or 4 sisters, daughters of Nyx and Erebus, or perhaps of Atlas, or perhaps of Zeus and Themis. The stories varied, their parentage as mysterious as their nature. They lived in a garden at the western edge of the world, where a tree bearing golden apples grew, a wedding gift from Gaia to Hera when she married Zeus. The Hesperides sang with beautiful voices as they tended the garden, and their names, Aegle, Erythea, Hesperia, and sometimes Arethusa, meant glow, red, western, and watered, speaking to their nature as spirits of the evening. With them dwelt Ladon, the 100-headed dragon who never slept, toiling around the tree and guarding the golden apples. These apples were not merely fruit, but symbols of immortality, of the gods' eternal life, and they were so precious that their theft was nearly impossible. Yet Heracles, for his 11th labor, was sent to steal these apples, and he succeeded, either by killing Ladon or by convincing Atlas to retrieve them. The golden apples appeared in other myths too. Paris awarded one to Aphrodite in the judgment that started the Trojan War, and Atalanta was defeated in her race when suitors threw golden apples in her path, distracting her. The Hesperides represented the beauty of evening, that golden hour when the sun's light turned warm and amber, when day gave way to night. They were the peace of dusk, the gentleness of fading light, guardians of a garden that represented paradise, an impossible place of perfection at the edge of the world. Sailors who ventured far west told stories of glimpsing their garden in the distance, of hearing their singing carried on evening winds. But none could reach it, save by the gods' will. The Hesperides remained forever at the boundary, at the liminal space where day ended and night began, tending their eternal garden, singing their eternal songs. In the far north, beyond Thrace, beyond even Scythia, lay the land of the Hyperboreans, a blessed people who lived in perpetual springtime and sunlight, never experiencing winter or darkness. The Hyperboreans were favored by Apollo, who visited them for 3 months each winter while Delphi slept, dwelling among them in their paradise. The Hyperboreans lived for 1,000 years without disease or war, spending their days in music, dance, and celebration. When they finally chose to end their lives, they would leap joyfully from a particular cliff into the sea, dying in bliss rather than suffering decline. The Hyperboreans were pious and just, offering hecatombs to Apollo, and in return, the god blessed them with eternal happiness. Some said the Hyperboreans were the origin of Apollo's cult, that he had learned music and prophecy from them before bringing these gifts to Greece. Abaris the Hyperborean was a priest of Apollo who traveled the world carrying an arrow that allowed him to fly, eating nothing during his journey, serving as Apollo's emissary. The Hyperboreans represented an ideal, a utopia beyond the known world, where virtue and piety were rewarded with perfect happiness. They challenged Greek assumptions about the necessity of suffering, suggesting that somewhere, somehow, humans could live in unending joy. Yet they remained forever distant, forever unreachable, their land lying beyond all maps, accessible only to Apollo and his chosen few. The Hyperboreans reminded Greeks that their world, with its wars and sufferings, its struggles and compromises, was not the only possible world, that divine favor could create paradise, even if that paradise was not for them. The god Aristaeus was a rustic deity, son of Apollo and the nymph Cyrene, associated with beekeeping, cheese-making, olive growing, and hunting. Aristaeus was born in Libya, where Apollo had carried Cyrene after finding her wrestling a lion bare-handed, impressed by her strength and courage. Apollo gave their son to the myrtle nymphs and to Chiron the centaur to raise, and they taught Aristaeus all the rustic arts, how to cultivate olives, how to make cheese, how to track game, and most importantly, how to keep bees. Aristaeus traveled throughout the Mediterranean world, teaching these arts to mortals, showing them how to tend hives and harvest honey without destroying the colonies, how to press olives for oil, how to curdle milk and age cheese. These practical skills made Aristaeus beloved by farmers and shepherds who honored him with offerings of the first fruits of their labor. The first honey, the first oil, the first cheese. But Aristaeus also featured in tragic tales. He pursued the nymph Eurydice, wife of Orpheus, and in fleeing from him, she stepped on a serpent and died. When Orpheus failed to bring Eurydice back from the underworld and was torn apart by Maenads, the bees of all the world died in mourning. Aristaeus, who depended on bees for much of his reputation and worship, was distraught. He consulted the sea god Proteus, who told him that to restore the bees, he must sacrifice cattle to appease Eurydice's shade. Aristaeus did so, and from the rotting carcasses of the cattle, new swarms of bees emerged, a belief called bugonia, the idea that bees could be generated from dead oxen. This strange belief was widely held in antiquity, showing how gods and their myths explained natural phenomena even incorrectly. Aristaeus wandered widely, eventually settling in Sardinia or Sicily or Thrace, depending on the version, continuing to teach his useful arts. He represented the boundary between wild and cultivated, between nature and agriculture, showing mortals how to work with nature rather than against it, how to gather its bounty sustainably rather than destructively. And so the forgotten gods return to their obscurity, their stories told once more before fading again into the mist. These were the gods of threshold spaces and transitional moments, of emotions and crafts, of places at the edge of the known world. The great Olympians commanded temples and received grand sacrifices, but these lesser powers inhabited the small moments, the quiet places, the specific needs and fears of ordinary mortals. They were the gods who made daily life possible, who governed the forgotten necessities, who watched over the neglected corners of existence. Though their names have faded and their temples crumbled, though few now remember to honor them, they endure in the structure of the world, in snow on mountains, in dreams at night, in the forgetfulness of time, in the golden glow of sunset, in the honey of bees, in memory itself. Sleep now, and perhaps in your dreams you will meet them, these forgotten gods who have waited patiently through the centuries for someone to remember their names, to honor their stories, to acknowledge that they too were divine, they too mattered, they too shaped the world in their own small but essential ways. Rest peacefully under their ancient, patient watch.